She moved through Mercy General like someone who understood that invisibility was a survival skill. Brooke Sullivan's shoulders curved slightly inward when she entered a room, her scrubs a faded blue that blended into the hospital's endless palette of pale walls and chrome railings. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their constant drone, a sound most people stopped hearing after the first week. She didn't. Every alarm, every beep, every mechanical breath of a ventilator registered in her nervous system like sonar. 7 years at Mercy General and the other nurses still couldn't quite place her accent, her background, the way she moved through the cardiac unit with a precision that looked effortless but never was. The antiseptic smell cut through the recycled air, sharp, chemical, permanent. It had long ago replaced any memory of dust and diesel fuel. Her hands, when she wasn't thinking about them, moved with the economical grace of someone who had performed procedures in far worse conditions than a climate-controlled hospital in San Diego. She adjusted an 4-drip on room for 12, her fingers steady as a surgical laser, reading the patient's baseline vitals before the nurse on call had even finished charting. The monitor showed sinus rhythm, steady, clean, reliable. She touched the patient's wrist with her fingertips, the way someone might check a pulse that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with what her body already knew. 72 beats per minute. Stable. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," Brooke said, her voice barely above a whisper. Soft. Deferential. The kind of voice that apologized for existing in spaces that had names on doors. "How are you feeling today?" The elderly woman in the bed smiled, reaching for Brooke's hand. Most patients did that, gravitated toward her, even when they didn't understand why. It wasn't because she was warm. It wasn't because she offered false reassurance. It was because something in her presence, the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already survived the worst, made them believe they would survive this too. "Much better, dear. You're so kind to ask." Brooke squeezed her hand once. Exactly once. Professional. Measured. She wrote a note on the chart and moved to the next room, her badge catching the fluorescent glare as she walked. The badge read Brooke Sullivan, RN. Nothing else. No certifications listed, no special credentials, no mentions of the skills that lived in her muscle memory like ghosts. It was 7:33 a.m. when she stopped at her locker in the break room, a narrow space in a hallway that smelled like cold coffee and someone's abandoned lunch from 3 days ago. She spun the combination lock with practiced precision. Click. 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 The door swung open to reveal folded scrubs, a thermos, extra socks, and at the very bottom, nearly hidden beneath everything else, a pair of combat boots. The leather was cracked and stained with something that hadn't been dust in a very long time. Desert sand. Sand from Helmand Province, from 11 hours in a field hospital with a roof that held only because she held it, with mortar rounds that had the terrible politeness of explosions that missed her by meters instead of inches. She reached down and touched the leather. Her fingertips traced the lacing, the worn eyelets where so many bootlaces had been tied in the dark. Her hand trembled slightly, a physical tell she could never suppress when she wasn't speaking, when her attention was inward instead of outward. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the weight of 3 bronze stars and a Purple Heart and a Navy Cross that no one at Mercy General knew she carried inside her chest like shrapnel that would never be removed. She closed the locker door. 12 seconds of contact. That was the ritual. 12 seconds to remember who she had been, then 30 seconds to become who she was now, a nurse. Just a nurse. Unremarkable. Forgettable. Safe. Morning rounds began at 8:15 a.m. Dr. Sterling arrived with his white coat freshly starched, his hair the color of old money, his smile the kind that belonged to men who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He moved through the cardiac unit like a man walking through a museum that existed to display his taste. Behind him came the residents, 2 nervous young men and 1 woman who looked like she was calculating the fastest exit route. Sterling didn't make eye contact with any of them. He didn't need to. The hierarchy was absolute. The hierarchy was his armor. Brooke stood at the nurse's station with the morning charts organized in the specific order Sterling preferred, room number ascending, vital signs in columns, notes concise and secondary. She had learned his preferences the way she had learned to operate under fire, through observation and correction, but mostly through the terrible clarity that came when mistakes cost lives. His mistakes never cost anyone. Her hypothetical mistakes would end her career. "Room for 08, Sterling announced, and the small entourage moved as a unit. The bed held a 73-year-old man named Thomas Reeves, 3 days post-op on a coronary artery bypass, recovery tracking perfectly normal. Sterling pulled the chart from Brooke's hands without looking at her. "Vitals have been stable since 6 a.m., Brooke said quietly. "No arrhythmias overnight. Ejection fraction holding at 48%. Sterling glanced at the monitor, then at the patient. "How long have you been a nurse, Sullivan?" The question was a trap. All of his questions were traps. Brooke kept her voice level. 7 years, doctor. "And in those 7 years, have you attended medical school?" "No, doctor." "Have you completed a cardiothoracic fellowship?" "No, doctor." Sterling turned to the residents with the expression of a man who had just made a point. "Then perhaps we should reserve the clinical assessments to those of us who are qualified to make them. The patient's vitals are adequate. We'll continue current medication protocols." He turned back to the chart. "Next room." The silence in his wake lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then he moved, and everyone moved with him, including Brooke. But between those 2 seconds, one of the residents, the woman who looked like she was calculating exits, met Brooke's eyes. In that glance was recognition of something. Not pity. Not sympathy. Just the understanding that some silences were small wars. "Room for 10. Room for 12 where Mrs. Chen smiled at the doctor and said nothing about how the nurse had already read her chart 3 times. "Room for 14 where a man named Douglas was recovering from an MI, and Sterling noticed something in the EKG strip that made him nod with satisfaction, as though the heart attack itself was proof of his diagnostic competence. "Your work on this patient's triage was competent," Sterling said to Brooke, still not looking at her. "Though I suspect the outcome would have been identical regardless of the initial assessment." Brooke had triaged Douglas at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. She had read the EKG in less than 30 seconds. She had called cardiology before the attending physician had even arrived. She had positioned him on the catheterization table before his wife had finished calling their daughter. But none of that mattered, because Sterling was the surgeon, and the hierarchy was absolute, and her job was not to save lives. That was the doctor's privilege. Her job was to adjust fours and nod and disappear. "Thank you, doctor," she said. By 10:44 a.m., the emergency intubation came through like a radio crackle, a 71-year-old woman named Patricia, presenting with acute respiratory distress, EKG changes consistent with anterior wall MI, and an oxygen saturation that was dropping fast. The ambulance was 8 minutes out. The team assembled like muscle memory, respiratory therapy, cardiology, nursing staff. Brooke moved to the trauma bay and began the rapid setup, monitor leads, for access, crash cart inventory check. Everything had its place. Everything had its purpose. The ambulance doors opened and the paramedics wheeled the patient in with the kind of controlled urgency that meant they had seen this before and seen it go both ways. Patricia's breathing was shallow, desperate, the sound of someone whose lungs had betrayed her. Brooke initiated for access, an 18-gauge in the antecubital fossa, clean stick, blood drawn back immediately. Saline drip initiated. Medication ready. She was setting up for a possible intubation when she glanced up and saw a nurse she hadn't worked with in 3 years, someone from the old surgery rotation, someone named Marcus who had transferred to trauma a lifetime ago. He was drawing labs, and he was watching Brooke's hands. When the doctor asked for blood work, Brooke assisted on the monitor. Her fingers moved, grabbing a pressure bag, adjusting before, reading the numbers before they stabilized. During the process, when the attending was focused on the patient's airway, she found herself performing a vessel hold, a 3-finger clamp technique that wasn't taught in modern nursing programs anymore, that lived only in the hands of people who had worked field hospitals in places where modern equipment didn't exist and tourniquet placement was a luxury. It was a micro-movement, less than a second, the kind of thing no one was supposed to notice. Marcus's hand froze. He looked at her. His mouth opened. "Angel," he whispered. "You were in Helmand. I recognize that hold. We ran medevacs together, different units, but I remember that hold. I never saw anyone else do that." Brooke did not break her composure. She did not flinch. She did not acknowledge the words. She continued her work, her hands moving with the precision of someone operating on autopilot, all of her attention suddenly internal instead of external. The monitor showed the patient stabilizing, oxygen saturation climbing, heart rate normalizing, blood pressure holding. Good. Good. The crisis was resolving. It wasn't a request to talk. It was a command to continue. And Brooke obeyed, moving through the rest of the emergency with the mechanical efficiency of a woman whose body knew how to survive even when her mind was somewhere else entirely. By 3:15 p.m., when the shift was nearing its close and Patricia was stable in the CCU, Brooke returned to her locker. She sat on the wooden bench that smelled like old wood and the accumulated sweat of people trying to decompress for 30 seconds in a place designed for no decompression at all. She opened the locker again. The combat boot stared at her from the darkness. The screams from Helmand Province were not loud anymore. They had faded over 7 years into something quieter, something that lived in the spaces between heartbeats, something that emerged at exactly 3:15 p.m. on days when someone recognized something she had spent 7 years trying to bury. Her hands trembled. She folded them together, squeezing one wrist with the opposite palm, grounding herself in the pressure. Muscle memory. Pain is information. Information can be processed. Information can be survived. She touched the combat boots again. Not 12 seconds this time. Just 3. Then she closed the door, and her shift ended, and she walked back out into San Diego's October afternoon where no one was dying and no one was asking her to remember who she used to be. The October afternoon in San Diego was the kind that made people forget why they'd ever lived anywhere else. 72 degrees. Eucalyptus trees releasing their medicinal scent into the breeze. The kind of weather that made suffering feel impossible, which is exactly why Brooke Sullivan found it unbearable. She walked through the employee parking lot at Mercy General with her scrub still damp at the collar from an hour spent in the cardiac ICU, and her phone buzzed with a text from her sister, *call me. Mom wants to know about Thanksgiving. She didn't call. She got in her 2008 Honda Civic, blue paint dulled by San Diego salt air, and sat in the driver's seat for 4 minutes, hands at 10 and 2, before she started the engine. The next morning, the humiliation had already begun before her shift officially started. She was reviewing charts at the nurse's station when Dr. Sterling appeared with a cluster of medical students trailing behind him like remeras attached to a shark. The morning sun cut through the east-facing windows of the cardiac unit, painting everything in sharp relief. He was moving through his rounds with the kind of theatrical precision that made everyone within eyeline acutely aware of his presence. Sterling had that particular gift, a voice that commanded a room without raising in volume, a posture that made the space around him feel smaller. His shoulders moved as if the hospital existed to accommodate them. The first patient was retired Colonel Marcus Webb, admitted 3 days ago with new-onset atrial fibrillation. His family was already gathered at the bedside, a daughter in expensive sunglasses, a son in a suit that probably cost more than Brooke's monthly rent, and a wife whose anxiety had become a fourth vital sign on his chart. Brooke had adjusted his metoprolol dosage overnight. His heart rate had been hammering at 140 when she'd reviewed his telemetry at 2 a.m. By 6 a.m., it had settled to 82. Stable. Exactly what the protocol called for. Dr. Sterling picked up the chart. He stood at the foot of the bed, perfectly positioned so the family could see his face, so the medical students could absorb every nuance of his authority. "Nurse Sullivan," he said, and his voice had that particular timbre, pleasant on the surface, edged with something that made your nervous system register threat even when you weren't sure why. "Did you attend medical school in your spare time? Or do you simply enjoy playing doctor when actual physicians aren't watching?" The daughter's mouth tightened. One of the medical students, a young man with acne scars and desperate eyes, smirked. The colonel's wife flinched as if she'd been slapped. Brooke felt something crystallize in her chest. Not anger. Anger was sloppy. Anger was a tell. What she felt was more like a gear clicking into place, cold, mechanical, precise. She took one measured breath. Her hands remained steady. Not a tremor. Not a waver. She had held a field hospital together while mortar fire punched holes in the roof. She had stood over a 19-year-old with a femoral artery tear and told him he was going to make it even though she already knew he wasn't. She had made triage decisions at 3 a.m. that meant somebody's son didn't come home. She would not flinch at this man. A single tear escaped her left eye. She didn't know why. Her body betraying her, producing the exact response that would make her look fragile, breakable, wrong. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, the gesture sharp and dismissive. When she spoke, her voice had dropped into a register that made the medical students shift their weight backward. The patient's heart rate was 140. It's 82 now. Sir. Sterling's face flushed a deep crimson, not with shame, but with the particular rage of someone who'd expected compliance and received a fact instead. Your job is to follow orders, not think. Perhaps you've confused your role here. He pulled out his phone right there, typed something with his thumbs, and slipped the device back into his coat pocket like a man holstering a weapon. Brooke knew what was coming before it happened. Administrators received digital complaints now. Paperwork materialized like magic. The power structure at Mercy General wasn't democratic. It was feudal, and Sterling controlled the largest fiefdom. By the next afternoon, the formal write-up was posted on the bulletin board in the break room. Performance Improvement Plan. Citation for overstepping nursing scope of practice. Fabricated examples of medication errors she'd never made. The handwriting was Sterling's medical school cursive, expensive fountain pen. Everyone on the unit saw it. Everyone saw her name in print, catalogued next to words like insubordinate and concerning judgment. The break room became a geography of exile. She entered the next day at 11:27 a.m., lunch bag in hand. For nurses sat at the center table, Rodriguez from the night shift sat there too, and Brooke felt the weight of her recognition like a spotlight. The conversation died the moment her shadow crossed the threshold. Within 90 seconds, they dispersed. First Rodriguez, who stood and made an excuse about checking on something. Then Chen, who suddenly remembered medication documentation. Then Martinez and Kim, who abandoned their yogurts and sandwiches like refugees fleeing a disaster. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Brooke sat alone at a table meant for 8 people and ate her turkey sandwich while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects. This pattern repeated for 5 days. Every time she entered the break room, the exodus began. It was coordinated but not discussed, the kind of social violence that leaves no fingerprints. By day 6, she stopped going to the break room altogether. She ate in her car instead, windows up, air conditioning running, the radio playing public radio news she didn't process. Sterling watched this unfold with the satisfied expression of a man who'd gotten exactly what he wanted. But that wasn't the worst part. On day 8, he cornered her in the ICU hallway. She was walking toward Trauma Bay 2 with a medication drip in her hands when she felt his presence materialize beside her like a weather system. The hallway was busy, other nurses, orderlies, a patient being wheeled past, but Sterling had chosen this location precisely because it was public enough to be seen, private enough to be heard only by those close enough to matter. Florence Nightingale, he said, his voice pitched at a conversational level that somehow carried weight, density, threat. I've been looking at your medication logs from the past 6 weeks. There's a concerning pattern. She kept walking. The drip in her hand remained steady. Muscle memory took over. Hands that had adjusted for lines under live fire could certainly manage pharmaceutical drips while being verbally annihilated by a 48-year-old man with a god complex. There are no errors, she said quietly. All dosages were verified against protocol. Perhaps that's your interpretation. He was matching her pace, keeping step with her as if they were colleagues having a normal conversation. To anyone watching, it might have looked that way. To Brooke, it felt like being hunted. But I'm seeing a pattern of poor judgment. Unauthorized adjustments. Decisions made without appropriate physician oversight. You're beginning to develop a reputation, and not a positive one. She stopped at the medicated drips destination ICU room for 12. She hung the medication, checked the rate, verified the line placement. Every movement was hospital protocol, executable and methodical. She did not acknowledge his presence. She did not respond. If she opened her mouth, the sound that came out might not be professional. Might not be measured. Might reveal the sound of someone who'd heard men scream while watching their own blood color the sand beneath them. Sterling leaned against the doorframe. He was smiling. You know what's going to happen, don't you? People talk. They remember. By the time this PIP is complete, everyone will know exactly what you are. What's that, sir? She turned to face him. Her composure was intact. Carefully constructed, like a field surgical bandage applied to a wound that would never fully heal. A nurse who's in over her head. Someone who mistakes experience for expertise. Someone who's going to end a career here before she's barely begun one. She walked past him. The ICU hallway smelled of antiseptic and something else, the particular scent of human bodies breaking down, kept functioning only by machines and chemicals, and the stubborn refusal of nurses to let them slip away. She'd smelled worse. She'd smelled Helmand Province in August, blood and diesel and human waste and the copper-sweet tang of gunpowder that never quite left your sinuses. I'm going on break, she said to the charge nurse at the station, and her voice was calm in a way that made the woman look up from her computer with a flicker of confusion. Back in 30. She found the supply closet on the second floor, the one they used for overflow crash equipment. Nobody noticed her slip inside. The space was maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, lined with defibrillator pads and 4 kits and bandaging supplies organized in color-coded arrays. She sat on the floor with her back against a shelf of sterile gauze packages, and her hands began to shake. Not fear. She'd processed fear a long time ago, during a night in Helmand when mortars landed close enough to rearrange her hearing. This was something different. This was the trembling of restraint, the physical cost of maintaining composure while someone tried to dismantle you in public. The tremor moved through her fingers like electricity through water. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and forced them to be still. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, once, twice, then held steady. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, she was back in the field hospital. The generator was failing. The power cut out. They operated in headlamp light on a 19-year-old kid with a blast wound, and she was the senior ranking officer there, which meant every decision was hers. Every hand on that table was waiting for her command. She held that hospital together for 11 hours while the fighting continued outside. Held people's lives in her hands. Held young men while they died because their wounds were incompatible with survival. She opened her eyes. The supply closet fluorescent light was steady now. Just a flicker. Just a hospital light doing its job. Her hand stopped shaking. She sat there for 20 more minutes, then walked back to the cardiac unit like nothing had happened. She clocked back in from her break. She reviewed her patients. She adjusted medications based on protocol, documented everything with precision, answered Dr. Sterling's questions with deference and brevity. Just another day at Mercy General. Just another nurse being carved down to size by a surgeon who'd mistaken rank for respect. But Rodriguez had been there during the Code Blue. Rodriguez had seen the three-finger vessel clamp technique, the exact hold that Navy corpsmen learned in the field, that Air Force nurses in Bagram recognized as distinctly military medicine, distinctly a tool of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions outside of civilian hospitals. Brooke had felt Rodriguez's stare all afternoon, a question being held in check, waiting for the moment when protocol permitted revelation. That night, she sat in her apartment, a one-bedroom in Ocean Beach with bare walls, no photos on any surface, no evidence that anyone actually lived there, and she pulled open her closet. On the floor, beneath civilian shoes arranged with military precision, were her combat boots. The leather was scuffed and worn. The insoles had molded themselves to her feet 11 years ago and never forgotten the shape. Sand from Helmand was probably still embedded in the creases. She picked them up. The weight was familiar. The smell of boot leather and desert dust and memory came back immediately, complete, overwhelming, perfect in its clarity. Nobody knew. Her sister called weekly and Brooke let it go to voicemail. Her family believed she'd worked hospital administration stateside. They thought she'd had a normal career, normal years, the kind of work you didn't bring home. She'd never told them about the screams in the field hospital, the faces of those who didn't make it, the triage decisions made at 3 in the morning when you were the senior ranking officer and every hand on that operating table was waiting for you to decide who lived and who didn't. She'd rebuilt herself as forgettable because the weight of command had broken something inside her that couldn't be repaired. Not by time, not by distance, not by hiding in a hospital in San Diego where nobody would ever ask her name. But Rodriguez knew. And Rodriguez wasn't going to let it rest. General Marcus Hale arrived at Mercy General on a Tuesday morning when the cardiac unit was already drowning in its own chaos. The elevator doors opened at 6:24 a.m., and with them came the kind of silence that only rank and authority could purchase, 2 discreet security officers in navy blazers, the faint outline of concealed weapons beneath tailored jackets, and between them a man whose posture suggested he'd spent 40 years making decisions that got other people killed. The general wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Brooke's monthly rent, and his presence moved through the hallway like a pressure change before a storm. Dr. Sterling heard about it before he saw it. One of the registration clerks called up to the unit. VIP cardiology consult, 6:30 this morning. 4-star General, Special Forces Command. Sterling's jaw shifted. He was in the break room, overpriced coffee in hand, the kind he only bought on days when he'd scheduled himself as the attending on high-profile cases. He set the cup down with the precision of someone placing a chess piece. He was down the stairs before the general security detail had finished clearing the pre-op waiting area. General Hale, Sterling said, his voice dropping 3 registers into the practiced warmth of a man who'd spent 2 decades courting hospital board members at charity galas. Dr. Marcus Sterling, Chief of Cardiology. We're honored to have you here. He extended his hand with the confidence of someone who'd never been refused anything in his professional life. The general's grip was firm, brief, the handshake of a man who measured people in milliseconds. Thank you, Doctor, General Hale said. His eyes were the color of winter Atlantic. My last EKG showed some irregularity. My physician thought it wise to get a second opinion from your program. You've come to the right place, Sterling said. Already he was calculating. A 4-star general meant congressional connections. Congressional connections meant funding, prestige, the kind of patient outcome that got mentioned in hospital board meetings and peer-reviewed journals. I'll personally oversee your care. No one else touches your case. The security officers exchanged a glance. They'd heard this before. Sterling turned toward the nurse's station and found Brooke reviewing a patient chart, her posture the same quiet geometry it always was, shoulders squared, attention absolute, invisible. He felt something like irritation at the sight of her. She was still here. Still working. Still in his peripheral vision like a scratch he couldn't reach. Nurse Sullivan, he called across the unit. Not warmly. Never warmly. You're reassigned to the orthopedic ward starting immediately. We're short-staffed downstairs. I need you on that detail. Brooke looked up. Her eyes didn't change. They never did. I'm scheduled cardiac for the next 4 hours, Dr. Sterling. I'm unscheduling you. He said it like an order to a subordinate, which is exactly what he believed she was. Martinez will cover your patients. You're done here. The room heard it. 3 nurses, 1 resident, the unit secretary, they all registered the dismissal. Some of them did that small thing people do when they witness power being exercised, they pretended not to notice. Brooke closed the chart. She stood without any rush, any anger, any visible recognition that she'd just been publicly removed from the only unit where she'd managed to construct something that resembled professional stability. She simply stood, gathered her badge, and moved toward the stairs with the same economical precision she used for everything else. But in that moment before she turned away, Sterling saw something cross her face. Not sadness. Not resentment. Something else. Something like calculation. Like someone measuring distance. It was gone before he could name it. Much better, Sterling said to no one in particular, already turning back to General Hale. Now then, General, shall we get you up to the cardiac care suite? I have the best equipment in the facility. We'll run a full workup, EKG, echocardiogram, maybe a stress test depending on what we find. I appreciate the thoroughness, the General said. His security detail remained positioned at the cardinal points of the conversation, one by the elevator, one by the supply corridor, one by the entrance to the unit itself. Sterling guided General Hale toward the cardiac suite, his hand barely touching the General's elbow, a gesture of deference and control all at once. Your family is welcome to wait in our VIP consultation room. Much more comfortable than the standard waiting areas. We have a private monitor there, you'll be able to see everything in real time. My daughter is in residency at Johns Hopkins, General Hale mentioned, almost absently. She always says the little details matter in medicine. Wise woman, Sterling said. He meant, I will remember this and use it. We believe the same thing here at Mercy General. Every detail matters when we're caring for someone of your significance. The General's wife and daughter had arrived while Sterling was orchestrating Brooke's removal. They sat in the waiting area, the wife composed in the way of military spouses, used to uncertainty and long separations, the daughter in scrubs, home for a consultation, watching the cardiac unit with the appraising eye of someone who understood the machinery. Sterling made certain to greet them personally. He spent 7 minutes with the daughter, asking about her research, nodding with practiced interest, the kind of attention that said, I recognize your quality. I see your intellect. Your father is in excellent hands. What he was actually building was a shield. If anything went wrong, and sometimes things did go wrong, even in the best facilities, even with the best doctors, he had already positioned himself as indispensable. The General would trust him. The family would trust him. The moment of crisis, if it came, would belong to him. Brooke was down on the orthopedic ward, reviewing charts for patients she'd never met, when she felt something shift in the hospital's pulse. It was subtle. Just a change in air pressure. The way the fluorescent light seemed to hum differently. The way the intercom traffic shifted from routine to slightly elevated. The way her body registered information that hadn't yet become conscious knowledge. She was charting a post-op hip replacement when her phone buzzed. A text from Rodriguez, the traumatized veteran nurse who'd recognized her military medical technique 3 days ago, General's upstairs. Sterling locked him down. You're gonna want to know, the message cut off, unfinished. Rodriguez was smart enough not to finish that sentence in writing. Brooke didn't respond. She didn't have to. She already knew what Sterling was doing. It was the same calculation she'd made 100 times in Helmand Province: identify the power source, position yourself adjacent to it, make yourself indispensable to that power's survival. Sterling had read the General the same way a predator reads prey, not with malice, but with the cool assessment of someone who recognized an opportunity to feed. But there was something Sterling didn't know. Something he couldn't know, because it existed in the space between Brooke's visible exhaustion and her hidden training. There was a body's knowledge. The kind of knowing that came from 11 years of field medicine, from watching patterns, from reading vital signs the way other people read books. The kind of knowing that never really turned off, even when you tried to retire it. Even when you tried to become someone unremarkable. She was finishing the orthopedic charts at 9:15 a.m. when she noticed it. Not through monitors. Not through any technological intermediary. She noticed it the way she'd noticed a Taliban commander's irregular breathing at 30 yards, the way she'd noticed that a 17-year-old casualty's pupils weren't responding to light. The notice was in her hands. In the quality of her attention. Something was wrong with General Hale's respiratory pattern. She was 3 floors below him, separated by concrete and steel and the institutional indifference of a hospital that didn't know she existed, and she knew with the certainty of a combat medic that something was beginning to fail in a 4-star general's chest. The hospital's intercom crackled at 9:23 a.m. with the routine of an ordinary Tuesday. Attention all physicians. Stat cardiology consult, 2nd floor, VIP suite. I repeat, stat cardiology consult, 2nd floor VIP suite. That wasn't Sterling's voice. That was panic. That was the resident who'd been assigned to monitor the general's baseline vitals, probably a young doctor who'd never heard a superior admit that something had gone sideways. The message repeated twice more before the intercom cut to silence, and in that silence, the hospital's chemistry changed in an instant. The orthopedic ward felt the shift. The nurses started moving differently. The code-related anxiety that everyone on staff carried in their bone marrow suddenly activated. Brooke closed the chart she was holding. She didn't move quickly. She didn't rush. She simply stood with the deliberation of someone making a choice, and then she began walking toward the stairs. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The only thing that had changed was the decision she'd just made, and that decision was already reshaping her trajectory through the hospital. She took the stairs instead of the elevator. 2 floors up. The cardiac unit door opened before she reached it, and she passed through like she'd never been removed from it in the first place, like Sterling's orders existed in some other category of reality that didn't apply to what was actually happening. General Hale was in the suite, his charcoal suit jacket already removed, his shirt open, and on his bare chest was the geometry of a medical crisis unfolding in real time. His oxygen saturation was dropping, the monitors showed it in red numbers like a countdown, 92, 89, 86. His trachea was deviating slightly to the left. His breathing was shallow and asymmetrical. His nail beds were peripherally cyanotic. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of emergency that would have gotten someone killed in Helmand if you didn't know it immediately, if you didn't move in the next 90 seconds, if you hesitated for even the space of a breath. Sterling was standing there, frozen. The resident was frozen. General Hale's family was frozen, his wife's hand over her mouth, his daughter understanding exactly what was happening because she could read the monitors the same way Brooke could. 14-gauge angiocath needle, Brooke said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't requesting. It wasn't asking permission. It was giving orders. Decompression at the 2nd intercostal space, midclavicular line. I need it now. Who the hell are you? Sterling's voice had somehow become smaller in the presence of actual crisis. Push the family back, Brooke said to Rodriguez, who had appeared at the door with the instinct of someone who'd already recognized who the real command authority was in this room. Code Blue standing by. And get me a chest tube set up. She was already moving toward the general. The needle appeared in her hand from somewhere, grabbed from the emergency cart, muscle memory handling the mechanics while her conscious mind stayed focused on the patient. General Hale's eyes had shifted to her, and there was something in them that suggested recognition, or maybe just the knowledge of someone who'd survived 40 years of military service by trusting the people who moved with certainty when everything else was chaos. She found the intercostal space through his ribs the way her hands had done it 173 times before. There was no hesitation. There was no doubt. There was only the precision of training meeting crisis, and the hiss of air escaping under pressure as the needle breached the pleural membrane and the pneumothorax decompressed in that single moment that meant the difference between cardiac arrest and survival. The monitors began climbing. 86, 89, 92, 95. The trachea began shifting back to center. The general's breathing deepened. His wife's hand moved to his shoulder. I'm going on break, Brooke said quietly, stepping back from the bedside. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. Around her, the room was still registering what had just happened, but she'd already moved past it the way you moved past everything in the field. Rodriguez, you stay with him for the chest tube. Call me if the sat drops again. She didn't look at Sterling. She didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. She simply moved back toward the door with the same economical precision she used for everything, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the hospital's understanding of who Brooke Sullivan actually was. The general's daughter was watching her leave. Her eyes were the same color as her father's, winter Atlantic, sharp enough to cut glass. She'd seen something in those 90 seconds that her father's regular physicians had missed. She'd seen someone move through a medical crisis like it was muscle memory written in her bones. And then the intercom crackled again, but this time it was different. This time it was asking for Brooke Sullivan to return to the cardiac unit immediately. The intercom crackled again, but this time it was different. This time it was asking for Brooke Sullivan to return to the cardiac unit immediately. She was 3 floors down when the second call came through, not a page, but a voice she recognized from the security team, tight with panic. Code. Trauma. Lobby. Now. Brooke moved before thinking. Her body knew what her mind was still pretending not to know. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. Down the stairwell. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects as she pushed through the lobby doors and found Chaos wearing a uniform. General Marcus Hale lay on the marble floor, his face the color of bruised plums. His security detail surrounded him, shouting into radios, useless hands hovering above his chest. One of them saw her coming and stepped aside, something in her movement, perhaps, or the way she cut through the crowd like a blade finding water. His breathing was absent on the right side. She could hear that silence from 5 feet away. Distended neck veins. Skin dusky and failing. The trachea deviated. She'd seen this before in Helmand Province, seen it 3 times in 1 week when a roadside bomb hit a convoy and the survivors came through her field hospital with their chests collapsing inward, their bodies suffocating from the inside out. Dr. Sterling was there. He stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, his hands shaking, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He was looking at the general's face the way a man looks at a problem he cannot solve, and in that moment, Sterling was the problem. He was the hesitation. He was the reason the general's oxygen saturation was dropping, why the lips were turning blue, why each second that passed was a second the man was dying. Brooke didn't ask permission. She'd stopped asking for permission somewhere between Kandahar and here. She ripped open the general's dress shirt, buttons scattered across marble like spent shell casings. Her fingers found the second rib, counted down to the third intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She palpated the landmarks with the certainty of someone who'd done this under fire, who'd kept men alive by touch alone when the lights went out and the only thing that mattered was muscle memory and steadiness. 14-gauge needle. Now, she said. Not a request. A command. A trauma resident, young, trained, but not trained like this, thrust the angiocath toward her. She didn't hesitate. The needle went in. The landmark was perfect. The rush of air came next, that sound like a tire deflating, like a breath being released that had been held too long. The general gasped. Color flooded back into his face like someone had thrown a switch. 40 seconds. Complete collapse to breathing. 40 seconds from death to life. Chest tube kit. Trauma surgeon. Level 1 rapid infuser. Move, she ordered, already moving her hands toward the next step, already calling things out like she was back in that field hospital in Helmand with her hand steady and her voice steady and the weight of command settling across her shoulders like a familiar coat she'd hoped never to wear again. They moved. They actually moved. An ambulance was loading the general within minutes. His breathing was stable. His color was returning. His security detail was watching her with an expression somewhere between gratitude and shock. Sterling stood motionless, his face drained white, and then the hesitation broke and something darker took its place. What have you done? His voice was quiet. Controlled. Dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the way men like Sterling operated when they realized they'd been diminished in front of witnesses. You just performed a surgical procedure without physician authorization. You violated protocol. You? Brooke was already walking away. The general was stable. That was all that mattered now. Everything else was noise. Within hours, Sterling activated his network. She found out later, found out from Rodriguez, who found out from someone in medical records, that he'd made 17 phone calls. 17. Board members he'd golfed with at Torrey Pines. The director of her nursing school from 15 years ago. An external review team that specialized in regulatory audits, the kind that came in with predetermined conclusions and left with justified documentation. He framed her life-saving intervention as a reckless protocol violation. He called it insubordination. He told the board members that she'd acted without physician oversight, that she'd overstepped her nursing scope, that she was a danger to patients. He conveniently omitted the part where the general would have been dead in 3 minutes. He omitted the part where Sterling himself had been frozen, useless, drowning in his own indecision while a man's oxygen levels crashed towards zero. The review team audited her last 6 months of patient care. 73 charts. They cherry-picked 3 incidents, all routine, all documented correctly, all completely defensible, and presented them as a pattern of reckless behavior. On paper, if you didn't know medicine and you didn't know her, it could look damning. The termination came 72 hours later. A closed-door meeting. Sterling's office. The banker's box already waiting beside his desk like a prop in a play that had been rehearsed multiple times. "Your services are no longer required at Mercy General," Sterling said. His smile didn't waver. His hands were steady. This was the version of himself he preferred, the victor, the man with the power, the administrator who could erase someone with paperwork and a speech rehearsed in front of his mirror. "Security will escort you out. There's a severance agreement. Sign it." The paper slid across the desk like a betrayal. 6 weeks of pay for 18 months of night shifts and double shifts and staying late to teach junior nurses and buying supplies out of her own pocket because the budget was tight. 6 weeks to disappear quietly and not sue and not speak and not remind anyone that she'd just saved a 4-star general's life. She signed. What else was there to do? Security walked her through the emergency department at 6:48 p.m., right at shift change. Every nurse who'd ignored her in the break room was there. Every doctor who'd pretended not to notice the whisper campaign Sterling had orchestrated. They watched her walk past with the cardboard box in her arms like she was carrying her own funeral. Rodriguez stood by the med cart and wouldn't meet her eyes. That hurt more than the rest of it. The rain started as she reached the bus stop on Harbor Drive. Not gentle rain. The kind that hammers asphalt like applause, like the sky itself is angry. She stood under no shelter because there was no shelter, just bus stop glass and the wind pushing rain through the gaps. The cardboard box was already getting soft. She held it tighter. Inside the box, a cracked World's Okayest Nurse mug that a med student had given her 2 years ago as a joke. A dying succulent with brown leaves that she'd kept on her locker shelf because something about its refusal to die despite the fluorescent lights and the neglect had felt like kindred spirit. A photo of her platoon medic, Torres, who'd taken shrapnel meant for her in 2017 and hadn't made it past surgery. She pulled the photo out and looked at it. Torres smiling, arm around her shoulders, both of them covered in dust and blood that wasn't theirs. Both of them still alive. Both of them thinking they'd stay that way. The rain soaked through her jacket. Her hands were shaking, and it took her a moment to realize it wasn't from cold. It was from the realization that maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe she couldn't just walk away from being a warrior. Maybe the cost of trying was always going to be this high, the loss of the only identity that had ever made sense, the loss of the place where she'd mattered, the loss of the man she'd tried so hard to become, the nurse who was just ordinary and quiet and small. Maybe she'd never been small at all. The bus pulled up at 7:13 p.m. She didn't get on it. She stood there watching the doors close and the bus pull away, and she thought about the general. She thought about the 40 seconds. She thought about Dr. Sterling's smile and the way power always protected itself, always found a way to justify the unjustifiable. 1 week. 7 days. That's how long she had before the phone call that would change everything. But standing at the bus stop in the rain, holding a box of ghosts and a photograph of a dead man and a job that had betrayed her, she didn't know that yet. She just knew that the person she'd been trying to kill, the soldier, the commander, the woman who'd held a field hospital alone, was still alive inside her, still breathing, still waiting for the moment when pretending was finally over. 1 week later, a high-security military ambulance pulled through the Mercy General loading bay with a police escort flanking both sides. The rotor wash from a Navy helicopter hovering overhead rattled every window on the 3rd floor, the sound of it like thunder that refused to stop echoing. Security personnel in tactical gear moved with precision, creating a corridor that made ordinary staff instinctively step back. The detainee transfer was routine, an international medical case, nothing more, or so the hospital administration had been told. Brooke was restocking the crash cart when the commotion began. She didn't look up. In her old life, she'd learned that being the last to notice things meant you became invisible. The cart's wheels squeaked as she pushed it down the hallway toward the ICU, her movements economical, purposeful, exactly like they always were. Just a nurse. Nothing special. Nobody important. That was the moment the former Taliban commander locked eyes with her from the transport gurney. His voice shattered the careful silence she'd built around herself. Not in English. In Pashto. The words came like a recognition that couldn't be denied, couldn't be swallowed, couldn't be pretended away. Maliki Helmand. The angel of Helmand. The woman who held the mountains. He began to struggle against the restraints, not with violence but with desperate emotion, like someone who'd been trying to find words for years and finally found them. You saved me. You gave me water when I was bleeding to death. You kept me alive even though I was enemy. I remember. I remember. The hallway froze. Security personnel exchanged glances. Hospital staff turned to stare at Brooke, who had gone absolutely still, the crash cart handle locked beneath her palms, her shoulders level, her face a study in controlled breathing. In that suspended moment, she was calculating threat assessment, exit routes, whether anyone in this hallway understood Pashto well enough to have caught what he'd said. Then his son stepped forward. A man in his early 30s, wearing a U.S. military translator's badge, tears streaming down his face like rain. He wasn't bothering to stop. Senior Chief. He said the words with the weight they carried, the rank like a key unlocking a door Brooke had tried to seal shut. Senior Chief, you saved my father's enemy, but you saved my whole village's children first. You are why I wear this uniform. You are why my sister is alive. You are why I breathed when I was born. He placed his hand over his heart in a gesture that transcended language. Thank you. Thank you for being a warrior when warriors were all we had. Brooke's jaw tightened. Her grip on the crash cart became something iron-forged. But her voice, when she finally spoke, remained level. You're welcome. For syllables. The entire weight of 12 years of service compressed into acknowledgement that asked no fanfare, needed no response. That's when the Navy SEAL team leader emerged from the security detail. He was built like a tactical manual with a heartbeat, his presence carrying the kind of gravity that made the air pressure change. He moved directly to Brooke and opened a classified file, the edges still marked secret and no phone, and began to read aloud, his voice steady and ceremonial, like someone reading a eulogy for someone still standing. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. Service record, 3 Bronze Stars for Valor under fire. 1 Purple Heart for wounds sustained during enemy contact, Helmand Province, 2014. And 1 Navy Cross. He paused. The silence stretched like a living thing. For holding a field hospital alone for 11 hours under sustained small arms and mortar fire while treating 47 patients with 0 loss of life. He looked up from the file. That's not just medicine, That's command. The hallway had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming like ghosts in the walls. Every face had turned toward Brooke now, not with suspicion, but with the kind of awe that comes from suddenly realizing the ordinary person beside you has done extraordinary things. Then a Pentagon official stepped from the shadows. He wore the insignia of a rear admiral, his dress whites pristine, his presence arranged with the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. He approached Brooke directly, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of federal orders. "Senior Chief Sullivan, you are being recalled under special order, reserve activation, effective immediately. The Pentagon has established a new combat medic training program, and we need someone who knows how to teach survival in impossible conditions. We need you." He extended a folder. "This is a job offer. And it's also a command." Brooke took the folder. Her hands were steady. Everything about her was steady now, not the pretense of steadiness, but the real thing, the kind that comes from finally being seen. That's when the Rear Admiral turned to face Dr. Sterling. Sterling had been watching from down the hallway, his face cycling through expressions, confusion, comprehension, then something that looked like the moment before a foundation collapses. Hospital security, the same officers who'd escorted Brooke out of Mercy General with a cardboard box 3 days earlier, moved toward him with purpose. They weren't threatening. They were just making sure he didn't leave. Dr. Richard Sterling, the Rear Admiral's voice carried across the now silent corridor like a judgment pronounced in a courthouse. "You are terminated from Mercy General effective immediately for dismissing a decorated senior chief petty officer during active drilling reserve status. That violates federal employment protection law. You are also terminated from active medical privileges pending a federal review for interference with military medical personnel." He paused, letting each word settle. "The Inspector General will be investigating your pattern of retaliation and falsified performance documentation." News cameras that had arrived for the detainee transfer captured everything. They had their story now, but not the one they'd expected. They had something better. Sterling's voice cracked when he tried to speak. "This is absurd. She was just a nurse. She violated protocols. I have board support." The words came out strangled, defensive, the voice of a man watching his architecture collapse in real time. The hospital's CEO appeared with legal counsel flanking him like bookends. "Dr. Sterling, the board was not aware you terminated a decorated military veteran. Your employment contract contained explicit protections for reserve personnel. You're done here. Security will escort you to collect your personal effects. You have 10 minutes. Rodriguez stepped forward. She was holding a printed email, her voice steady and careful, the way you speak when you're finally allowed to tell the truth. "I documented everything. Every humiliation during rounds. Every fabricated write-up. Every email where you disparaged her competence. I sent the full dossier to the Joint Commission yesterday morning." Other nurses began moving forward then, producing their own documentation, personnel evaluations that contradicted Sterling's narrative, timestamps that proved his allegations were impossible, a pattern of harassment that extended far beyond Brooke, touching everyone who'd ever questioned his authority. Sterling's network, the board members he'd golfed with, the administrators who'd returned his calls for years, evaporated like morning fog. Association with him had become career poison. The video went live within 3 hours on every military social media platform, decorated Navy hero fired, then vindicated. Sterling's face, frozen in shock as security escorted him out with his belongings in a cardboard box identical to the one they'd given Brooke, became a screenshot shared 1,000 times over. His wife filed for divorce papers within 6 days, citing public humiliation and irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. His country club membership was revoked after an emergency vote. His professional references stopped returning calls. 6 months later, in a strip mall storefront between a nail salon and a tax preparation office in a neighborhood nobody drove through by choice, Dr. Richard Sterling taught CPR basics for community members. Minimum wage. His medical license suspended pending investigation. His malpractice insurance revoked by every carrier that would take calls about him. He sat alone during breaks, scrolling through articles on his phone, watching the woman he'd tried to destroy build a career that would dwarf his entire legacy. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, Brooke stood on a stage in dress uniform before 300 combat medics, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force. Her worn combat boots, the the ones she'd hidden in a locker for 8 years, were finally retired to a shadow box mounted on the wall behind her, replaced by service shoes polished to a mirror shine. The trembling in her hands had stopped. Her voice, once whispered in the margins of other people's conversations, now carried like a command frequency that everyone in the room was locked onto. "You will face impossible choices," she said, moving across the stage with the kind of deliberate precision that comes from leading men and women into danger. "You will question whether you're strong enough. Whether you know enough. Whether you should even be alive when someone you tried to save didn't make it." She paused. "Let me tell you something I learned in Helmand Province, holding a field hospital while mortars came down like rain. Real strength sometimes looks like surrender. It looks like acknowledging that you can't save everyone. Real strength sometimes looks like knowing exactly when to stop pretending and start being a warrior. Because that moment, when pretending ends and you finally become who you actually are, that's when everything changes." The audience, 500 eyes from different branches of service, different backgrounds, different fears, hung on every word. General Hale, fully recovered from the tension pneumothorax that had nearly killed him, sat in the front row. Beside him, Rodriguez, newly transferred to the Pentagon's training command, was already taking notes on every word Brooke said. When the ceremony ended, a young Navy corpsman approached her, nervous, his frame moving like someone carrying a weight they weren't sure they could hold. "Senior Chief, I'm deploying to Syria next month. I'm terrified I won't be good enough. That I'll freeze when it matters." Brooke placed a hand on his shoulder. Her voice dropped, softening but not weakening. "Fear means you understand the stakes. That's not a weakness. That's clarity. Now let me teach you how to turn that fear into precision. How to turn doubt into preparation. How to become the person someone needs you to be when it matters most." That evening, video calling her sister, Brooke finally said the word she'd been unable to speak for years. "I was in the Navy. I commanded field hospitals. I earned things I couldn't talk about." Her sister was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm proud of you." Brooke felt something release in her chest, something she'd been holding so tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "I'm proud of me too," she replied. And she meant every word. The screen faded to a simple epilogue. Dr. Sterling's medical license was permanently revoked in 2024. Brooke Sullivan currently serves as Director of Combat Medical Training at the Pentagon. The final shot was her shadow box, the worn combat boots, side by side, their leather creased from years of standing in impossible places. Beside them, the Navy Cross. And beneath it all, a plaque engraved with words she now taught to everyone who'd listen: "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had to prove yourself to people who thought they already knew who you were, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Comment below, what would you have done in Brooke's position? And share this with someone who needs to know that hidden strength is still strength, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding it all together.